Hi, welcome to Azalea's Kitchen. Today I'll be showing you how to make beef casserole. This recipe is for my daughter at university. She asked me to show her how to make a simple beef casserole, but obviously if you cook it on top of the stove, it's a beef stew. I'll be showing you how to make two different ways. One is to brown the meat first, and that gives you that Maillard reaction which adds to the flavour of the casserole, or a very straightforward recipe where you just put everything into the pan and then shove it in the oven. Now, it may not have the depth of flavour as the first one, but it's still really flavoursome because a lot of the flavour will be coming out from the meat itself. The water from the meat will be coming into the pot, joining in with the water or stock and flavours that you have in there. And so at the end, you'll still get a very rich casserole. And I think sometimes when you're in a hurry, forget the browning of the meat, just feed the family. So this is one of those recipes where I'm going to be saying do your own way, depending on time, depending on effort, depending on whether you can be bothered or not, but do it because it's an incredible way of having a fantastic meal with a cheap cut of meat. Most of the time in the supermarket you'll see beef already diced up for stewing or casserole. In fact, in the butchers they also sell it like that. If I have to use it, I'll use it, but I prefer to use a whole piece and then dice it up myself. I normally dice it up larger chunks, and that's because I like to have quite a decent sort of sized meat by the time it's cooked for 2 hours, and it will shrink a bit. And I think that the ones that are pre-diced you end up with little tiny bits of meat. Also, they tend not to be from cuts that I particularly like for stewing or casseroling. For example, my favourite meat for long cooking has got to be the feather steak. It's not an easy one to buy because you don't see it available everywhere, but if you can get hold of it, it produces the most tender beef at the end of an hour and a half of cooking. It really does. It takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours. The other one that's also very good and very flavoursome, a little bit more chewy, is the skirt steak, and that's more available than the feather steak. My butchers actually will do it for me either, so if you get a good butcher's, they'll cut it from the piece of the animal. Apparently the skirt comes from like the long part, so you get a sort of like a concertina type of piece, thin and long. And this one, which is all of it, I've just diced half of it, is a feather steak, and apparently that comes, I think, from the front of the animal, and you don't get a lot of it. So if you're like me, you sort of rush to the butcher's to get it before anyone else does. I'm going to be starting with the casserole where you brown the meat first. And one of the benefits of having the meat in one big piece like this is that I brown it like that. I don't cut it up and then brown all 4 sides. I just do a little bit of a shortcut. So I cut into great big chunks as you saw here, and I'm going to brown it on all 4 sides and then remove it and then cut it into chunks for the casserole. It just saves on the time of having to brown little pieces at a time, all 4 sides. It's just a lot of work. So I do a little bit of a shortcut. A little bit of oil, only enough to really go around the bottom of the pan, just a tiny film of oil. You don't want oil to sort of be frying really, but it helps with not sticking to the bottom of the pan. So it should be nice and hot now. I'll put that in. And now it's time to turn it over to the other side. I just need to turn it to the last side. Okay, it's all done, and I'm going to take it out. Now in the pan where we've been browning the meat, there'll be all the residue, I'll show you, that you need to scrape off. And in order to do that, we use a bit of liquid. You can use water, stock, or a bit of wine, red or white, doesn't really matter. I'm using some white port, and that's because I'm Portuguese and I always have port in the house. But brandy, Madeira, and if you're a student like my daughter who doesn't have alcohol lying around the house for cooking, then half a lemon juice, so a tablespoon of lemon juice, or a bit of vinegar. Any vinegar apart from the malt vinegar, so a vinegar that has a little bit of flavour. And the acidity is actually really good in a casserole. It blends in with the flavours really well. That's what alcohol provides, as well as the flavour of the alcohol is some acidity. And so I would suggest any of those things. So I'm going to put the pan back on the heat, and I'm going to put about a tablespoon or two worth of port, and then just scrape all of that off. While that's reducing away a little bit and boiling off some of the alcohol, I'm going to just start with the onions for the throw it all in casserole. So a bit of oil, onions. Even though it's a throw in casserole, I still like to soften the onions, let them brown a little bit, and I just think it adds a little bit of sweetness to the casserole and a tiny bit of effort. Now I'm going to take the little tiny bit of residue of liquid, and I'm going to add the onions, little bit of oil, what I like to do is to add the herbs that I'm going to be using when the onions are softening. It just adds extra flavour. The oil is very good at carrying flavour throughout a dish, so I add it now. I've got thyme and bay leaf, but you could use other herbs such as oregano or rosemary if you like. These are just the classic two that I have. And also sometimes if you get those fresh bunches of parsley, use the stalks. So I'm going to let the onions soften right down with the herbs, and then towards the end I'll add the chopped garlic, and I'll add also some tomato puree, a small amount, not for making the casserole taste of tomato, but it just adds a really good background flavour to the whole dish. Now the onions are soft, so I'm going to add the puree, about a tablespoon's worth. Garlic, nearly forgot the garlic. Let the garlic cook for another minute. Okay, so now I'm going to add the meat back in, and then the water, the carrots. So for the meat that I had brown goes into this casserole. Plus that juice that came out. And this is a throw it all in. I'm going to add the water. Normally I use half stock and half water, but if you don't have stock or good quality stock, then use just water. If you're using a stock cube or using sort of concentrated stuff, dilute it much more than it says on the pack. It's otherwise it's I find it quite overpowering, and you sort of really don't get the benefit of the meats that you bought. So add enough water just to cover the meat. Now add the carrots, And I'm also going to add the salt. Add the salt at the beginning, because if you forget and you add it halfway or towards the end, it never quite seasons the inside of the meat properly. The sauce around it will be seasoned, but the meat itself inside, when you eat it, I can tell the difference. And so it's always important to add the salt at the beginning. And you always need more salt than you think you do for things like this. If you're using stock from a cube or from the concentrated packs, then that will have salt, and you need to reduce the salt that you add. And some pepper, some black pepper. A secret ingredient that I like to add for flavour, which has tons of umami flavour, and it's the same with the tomato puree. It has umami flavour. That's why you add it, for the extra depth of flavour, not to identify the individual ingredient. Is dried mushrooms, and I have here shiitake dried mushrooms. So I'm just going to not even bother to soak them, just put a small handful like this into there, and it's just a flavour booster, particularly if you haven't added stock and you're adding water. So I'm adding up to this one. And now I'm going to bring it up to the boil, or just before boiling point. Now, one of the biggest differences you'll notice between the two casseroles, the one that you brown the meat and one you haven't, is the one that you haven't, when it comes up to simmer, there'll be a sort of a foam, like a sort of bit of, it looks like a sort of scummy foam, and it's fine. It won't affect the flavour at all. You can remove it if you want to. I don't bother. But that's kind of one of the, I guess one of the big differences you'll see it. Like I said at the beginning, the flavour is still good, so it doesn't matter, but I'm just giving you as a notice of what happens. Now I also have here to add leeks and some mushrooms. You could add the mushrooms now and just put it into the oven, it's fine, but I tend to add them about half an hour before the casserole is ready. I just like them a little bit with a bit of texture, so I leave them towards the end. The leeks I add towards the end of cooking as well, because if you really cook leeks over the top and they sort of go into mush, they end up, I don't know if you ever had this, but they end up sort of fraying, and when you're eating it looks like little bits of hair, which is quite disconcerting. So I always tend to leave the leeks until much further on, about 30-40 minutes towards the end of cooking time. So I'm going to get the lids. The casseroles have had an hour in the oven, and I'm going to show you what they look like now. The liquid has reduced considerably from what you saw last time. Now I'm going to add the rest of the vegetables, and it's going to have another half an hour to an hour. It depends on the meat. I'm going to add some leeks. And the mushrooms. And I'm going to add a tiny bit of water, not too much. The more water you add now, the more you dilute the flavour, and also obviously the seasoning. Right, they're going back into the oven for another half an hour to an hour. Now they've had the 2 hours, so it's ready, and I'll show you how tender the meat is. If I just take a piece of the beef with the fork and show you just how it falls apart from it easily. And they're both like that, they're both tender, both cooked at the same time. I have written a post a while back on how to make a casserole. In it I have details on how to thicken the casserole if you want it with flour, and how to use flour. For example, never coat the meat with flour and then fry the flour at the beginning. Just don't do that. If a recipe says that, ignore it. It's just wrong. I'll link that link of the post below this video for you to have a look. Also, the recipe will be there as well. And I hope you enjoy this. I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching Azalea's Kitchen.